So I'm sitting here in the school this morning. It's a Saturday morning. Fortunately, I have my coffee in my new New York Sun coffee mug. Um, but I thought I would jump on here because stuff has been going on that always tempts me to get on and talk to you guys. So um, last night, maybe early this morning, I don't remember actually. I posted, that famous quote: "In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." And shortly, this, like I said, to some of the stuff that's going on, and I did promise I would put something up about this. Um, I had to look at the calendar this morning. It is, in fact, 2022, not 1970, not 1980, not 1990. It is 2022. And despite this, the level of ignorance, and remember, I always qualify this: ignorance is not stupidity. Um, Ignorance is just lack of knowledge, concrete knowledge. But the lack of ignorance among people that do Chinese martial arts remains pretty astounding, especially considering that there are sources out there. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. But I mean, think about it. Like when a lot of people were training like me, starting in the 70s and the 80s, what was available? Not that many different systems. Hungan and Wing Chun probably were the two most famous. There was some other stuff around. And if you were like in a Chinese community, especially like on the East Coast of the United States or the West Coast of the United States, you had access to other things. But again, there wasn't a tremendous amount. There was very little written material that was reliable, if at all. We didn't have YouTube. We didn't have videos. I mean, I always joke about the fact that, people say, like, why did you film more of Chan Tai San? Well, because we were lucky to have as much video as we had, because video used to be like a big camera that you had to have. It's not like nowadays where we walk around with a camera everywhere we go. And now there's YouTube. I mean, there's access. So in theory, though, people should be a little more educated about things. Now, some of this is the sources, and that's sort of what I want to talk about too, which is just because you set yourself up as a master doesn't mean you are one. And that applies even if you're Asian. Forgive me. There are a lot of people, masters of this, masters of that, masters of that. And, even if they don't have an agenda, even if they're not trying to deceive you, they may just not have the best stuff. But then again, there is a lot of more real stuff out there. But there's stuff, and even some of the sources that are out there are either they're not too great, or if you don't have another background in things, it can be deceiving. So, and the other thing was, and this happened even back in the 80s and 90s, a person that doesn't speak or Chinese, doesn't read or write Chinese, and doesn't have really like a cultural and historical foundation might get a source, maybe get a source in Chinese, and say like, well, let me find somebody that can read this to me and translate it for me. And maybe they find somebody that speaks Chinese and that person translates it for them. Well, first thing, and people that are educated in this stuff will know, is that just because you speak Chinese doesn't mean you're going to understand stuff written in Chinese about Chinese martial arts. It's its own subsect of knowledge. Second of all, are you educated enough to differentiate? I mean, we live in the world of conspiracy and nonsense. I mean, just look around you. There's tons of stuff in English that is just not only not accurate, it's just plain wacky. It's the same in Chinese. So somebody can translate something, and you can get somebody to translate something and give it to you. It doesn't mean you have the right information. You have to sort of go through it and figure out. You'd have to have some tools to go through it and evaluate it. And just copying it out of a book and thinking that just because you copied it out of a book, you're safe, and then saying, well, this is the accurate information, isn't necessarily true. It's good coffee. So, and Lama Pai is a good example of this. In the, we call them quote unquote Tibetan martial arts. I mean, obviously, there was Lion's Roar, and that gives birth to Lama Pai, but it also gives birth to Hakka or Xia Judgment, and then White Crane, Tibetan, quote unquote Tibetan White Crane. And, White Crane is often called literally Tibetan Shijang Bakpo, and in Lama Pai, you see commonly either Xizang Lama Pai or Macho Lama Pai. I'm using Cantonese now, just my de facto when I speak about Lama Pai. So, Tibet. Well, I mean, Xizang literally means Tibet if you translate it. But if you understand that in the Qing period, what they called Tibet wasn't just what we now think of as territorially Tibet. It was a region on China's western frontier that included places that we would now consider China, included groups that were not just Tibetans, ethnic Chinese, but also, for example, Mongolians and even Muslims. You have to remember that before the Qing, actually quite a period before, there was actually a Tibetan Empire. And Tibetan influences, both cultural and more importantly religious, Tibetan Buddhist religious influences remained in that region. So, if you really start reading into Tibetan Lama Pai history, you find out that it's not from what we would now consider Tibet. It's from Qinghai, which is would now be considered a province in China. And I just found a great historical article about this province during the Qing, and I was attempted to post it, but I realized that if you don't have a historical background, first of all, it's not a martial arts article in any way, shape, or form, and you may not appreciate it. But it really was sort of a place where, quote unquote, Tibetan influences, cultural and religious, Mongolian and ethnic Chinese merged. And you have to remember also the influence specifically of Tibetan Buddhism, because the Mongolians also embraced it. So when you're talking about Mongolians, you're also talking about people that follow Tibetan religion, even though they're not ethnically Tibetan or culturally Tibetan. But in Qinghai particularly, there was a huge Tibetan influence. So you could be from Qinghai. Chances were you were going to be a Tibetan-style Buddhist. Chances are you're going to be culturally influenced, and chances also were going to be that you're going to be influenced by Mongolians, particularly wrestling. So if you look at Lama Pai and you don't see the wrestling, you're not seeing the whole story. So, when you say Tibet, and then when we look at Mahjong, I would translate it as esoteric tradition, but people love the word secret, and so some people put secret tradition. And there are people that will say, well, I learned the secret style of Lama Pai. No, it's the name of the style. And the reason is that Mahjong, esoteric tradition, secret tradition, means the Tibetan Buddhism. And again, remember, that doesn't mean necessarily even monks. There are a lot of people in what we would now think of as territorially China that were influenced by what is Tibetan, technically Vajrayana Buddhism, because first of the early Tibetan Empire, and then later because the Mongolians themselves converted to Tibetan Buddhism, among other things. There's Mongolians that also converted to Islam, but that's a whole other story. So you see all these weird interpretations of things, or just lack of understanding that, I keep saying this all the time, Lama Pai in particular represents a Western frontier tradition of martial arts, which means it has more like what we think of as Northern long arm, Han ethnic martial arts, obviously. Some Tibetan, though we're not 100% sure what, but there's stuff in Lama that just doesn't look like other stuff. And then a whole lot of Mongolian wrestling, which is why, for me in particular, it was easy to sort of, not easy, but, I see the connections between the Shui Jiao, which is really Manchurian wrestling, strongly underlined, bolded, italicized, strongly influenced by Mongolian wrestling, and Lama Pai. But people don't see this because they don't have the background to see this. And people don't have the background also about individuals. They don't know enough about the culture and the backgrounds to see these things and know what they mean. Is every book reliable? The answer is no. Is every, and again, sometimes it's picking out truth. There's some truth and there's some not truth. I've said numerous times, including in my books, what I always found useful was I read a lot on the side for my personal enjoyment or personal interest. religious history, particularly the Historical Jesus Project. And how do you textualize and analyze the Bible, particularly the New Testament, and try to find out what in it is historically correct and what is historically incorrect, and what does that mean, and what is the significance, and why are there contradictions, and understanding how stuff is written. And what's interesting to me, and to a lot of people, I think, when you really understand this, is that understanding that martial arts history, quote unquote history, we put it in quotations, the stuff that's passed off as martial arts history, is very similar to religious tracts, in the sense that they're designed to give praise to a tradition and also to convert outsiders to the tradition. So they're prone to inaccuracies. Also, you're talking about two populations that were at best semi-literate. And so mistakes are made. And so I'm going blank on what the theory is. I'll have to go look it up. But there's a theory that says, for example, like, look at Lama Pai. We talk about Singlong. Well, barring a smoking gun and finding a document that's exactly about Singlong that we can verify, what can we say about him? Well, if you look at religious theory, people, especially during the nationalist period, wouldn't have picked a non-Han Chinese affiliated with Tibetan Buddhism as the founder of the system, if they were just making up a story. If you just had this method and you were just trying to find the history, it would be much easier to associate it with Shaolin. And in fact, there was a book written about Lama Pai that does try to link it to Shaolin and say that the creator was a Shaolin monk, right? Which is very predictable, but wrong. You wouldn't, Tibetan Buddhism at that point was associated with the two foreign Mongolian and Qing dynasties that were very unpopular. Non-Han Chinese were not very popular, so why would they pick that? Now, we then look at the story where he befriends that pirate, and I've demonstrated in my book, and if you're interested in doing it, go get the history book, the historical outline book. I've demonstrated that if we line up the dates that we know about Singlong, and we line up the dates we know about the pirate, the story couldn't possibly be true. They were in different periods and the dates don't line up. So we could say, well, that was probably a story created to give bona fides to Singlong and make him more like a patriot, because the pirate rebelled against the Qing dynasty. It made it more acceptable, as opposed to saying he was just a Tibetan Buddhist monk of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, who was not Han Chinese and showed up and started teaching. It's much better to say, well, but he was a patriot, and he was, with the pirate when the pirate was fighting the Qing, and that got upset when the pirate, surrendered to the Qing and all this other stuff. It's probably not true. In fact, we're almost 100% it's not true, because the dates don't line up. Singlong would have had to been something like 10 years old when he met the pirate. So then that's not the developed kung fu master that was able to best him in a kung fu duel, which no one seems to mention outside of that one tradition. Excuse me, my very good coffee. So we start picking through this stuff, and you can find some things that make sense and some things that don't make sense. But it's also amazing what people pass on, because people don't know the difference. And, they can sound authoritative by putting out even stuff that it really is astounding. Like, I have friends that train real systems, and friends that are fluent in Chinese, and, we look at stuff and go, how do they believe this? Or, can you believe that they believe this? But it sounds very authoritative to someone that doesn't know any better. There's just so much that's out here. I believe it weighs down the education of people, which is for the betterment of the arts and which will help the arts progress. It passes on these ridiculous ideas like, quote unquote eternal and not using strength, and the Chinese martial arts were never used for fighting, or the ever popular Wuda, Motok, uh, martial virtue stuff that comes out. It's frightening, but it's definitely out there. And as long as I'm still breathing and able to sip my coffee, I will still be addressing it. Um, Thanks for tuning in. This was a short one, I guess, but I just wanted to get this off my chest. This is David Ross. Have a great morning.